Okay, everyone, good morning once again, and welcome to the final webinar in the Global Leadership Series within Africa Business School. So today, we're going to complete the segment about the ELK framework. And after having explored ethics 3 weeks ago and knowledge last week, we're going to finish with logic today. So the first thing that one must address is that there's more than one logic possible. And this is something that is very important for anyone to address in a leadership position, especially in an international cross-cultural context. But even within the same culture, different disciplines, different professions can also have different underlying logics running their decision-making processes. So once again, as before, understanding one's own logic and one's own biases in terms of decision-making can only lead to better self-understanding, and this can drop the scales on how others can have different logics underlying their own decision makings, and so better self-awareness makes us more mindful of others' biases too. And as with the two previous chapters, this is an extract of my business ethics course, and this is actually the first topic I address in the fundamentals of thinking critically about oneself. And here we go. So what are logic questions? Well, logic questions can be simple knights and knave riddles, which are like games. For those of you who don't know the terminology, knights and knaves are logic puzzles where knights always tell the truth and knaves always lie. And I'm sure you at least know the riddle about the two guards each guarding a door. One door leads to death, the other leads to life, and one of the guards is a knight, the other is a knave. You can only ask one question, and you don't know, of course, which guard is the knight and which guard is the knave. So there are more complex riddles in this one, and so there's a whole literature in analytic philosophy on knights and knaves. And those of you who want to delve deeper, I encourage you to explore it. So in logic, is where you have to decide how you represent and manipulate unknowns, unknowables, volatility, subjectivity, certainty, assurance, and they are not the same thing. You can be sure of something and have no certainty, and vice versa. Complexity, complications, and ambiguity and ambivalence, which are also distinct concepts, although they sometimes overlap. So what you have to do is decide how you decide, and also sometimes how to decide not to decide, given these circumstances of knowns, unknowns, volatile knowledge, subjective, objective knowledge, and so on and so forth. Meta-logics questions, the questions that philosophers of logic would ask, include: is thought possible without language? Is reasoning guided by states or flows? Is the goal of the decision to reach a balance or to reach a truth? And what produces a paradox? Where does logic come from? Well, it comes from our cognitive representations. So in a sense, and this is also true for my ethics chapter, all of these can be incorporated in knowledge. It's just that ethics plays a specific part in knowledge and cognition, including decision making, and logic also does. So although they're both part of knowns, known knowns, unknown knowns, known unknowns, and to a lesser extent unknown unknowns, it's important to focus, to drill down on these specifically, because they actually guide our decision making. And so logic also comes from our reasoning or decision heuristics, and naturally from our language elements or vocabulary or grammar. So is thought possible without language? This is something that philosophers have explored for centuries. I'm personally not going to touch the subject today. Generally, in my own research, I've decided that I take language as a proxy for thought, because when you're doing research on a topic, you have to take sides on other topics to move forward. One thing that we're going to explore in practice today, however, is the ancient Greek debate between Heraclitus and Parmenides. And that is, Heraclitus famously said, or as quoted by Plato, no man steps twice in the same river, because it's not the same river and it's not the same foot. And the counter argument we have is that whatever is, which is credited to Parmenides, and which was also included in Aristotle's three laws of logic, which in English were expressed by Bertrand Russell a century ago. And that one is the first law of logic, the law of identity. Whatever is. So another question we can ask is, are contradictions in the subject, in the topic, or in the thinker? That also opens up questions about cognition and metacognition. So we are thinkers, and therefore we decide. And when we decide, we follow a certain logic. So let's go over the three types of logic that I've inventoried over the years pursuing this research. And let me be very clear that I don't necessarily believe that these are the only three possible. I've mostly focused my research so far on comparing Chinese and Western thought. And when I say Chinese, I'm really talking about ancient Chinese rather than contemporary Chinese. And when I say Western, I'm mostly thinking of European and American philosophers. And one of the reasons I joined Africa Business School is to delve more into indigenous philosophies from Africa and the Middle East. And Africa Business School presents me with this opportunity to enrich my ELK framework. Some have compared it to, in the way I present it, to the periodic table of elements, and it's obviously not as how shall I say? It's obviously not as clear, as well defined as empirically established at the periodic table, but it does share one feature with it, is that if I discover a new dimension, a new case, I can enrich it, just as new elements can be discovered in the periodic table. started over 150 years ago by Mendeleev. So the first logic is the Aristotelian logic, which is one that is very familiar to anyone who has studied mathematics. And it is the one with the free laws I just mentioned in the introduction. And these are Russell's expression in English of these free laws, first formulated by Aristotle. The law of identity, whatever is. The law of contradiction, nothing can both be and not be. And the law of the excluded middle, everything must either be or not be. And so essentially, this is a mechanistic logic. Aristotle believed that in a very deterministic world, and everything was put in motion by a prime mover, and everything in his representation of the universe, if we had perfect knowledge, we would have perfect predictive power, and everything is true or false, and there's no third state. So a binary logic. Second frame of thought, dialectical logic. And I should say that the one way to approach these three distinctive logics that is very helpful is to look at how they address contradiction. In Aristotle's frame of thought, contradiction is impossible. In Hegelian dialectical logic, contradiction is something to overcome. In other words, when you face two contradictory elements, all you need to do is to create a term that describes this tension between these two elements, and you enrich your vocabulary and you can move on in your discourse. So in other words, and this is a term that in the original German was aufheben. In French, we use the verb relever, elevate. And in English, the term that philosophers have agreed on is sublation, which is obviously a less common term in English. And it simply means that we identify the contradiction, we name it, and we move on in our exploration. And this is something that this is what rules the dialectical logic. That is so. In other words, we have change. Things are transient and finite. Everything is composed of contradictions, but it's easy to overcome it because we are not in a circular argument. We're not looping on ourselves. We're moving forward. So in a sense, we have instead of being in a circular argument, let's say like, hold on, like this, where we move from one element of the contrary to each other. We have to look at this over time, and what we have is a spiral moving forward. And that is, in essence, what sublation is about, how to address these contradictions. So it's a very fractal approach in a sense, and it's possible in Hegelian's logic to both drill down and less often to drill up, to explore refine our vocabulary, to approach contradictions and move beyond them. And the third logic that I've inventoried in this stream of research is Yin-Yang logic, which is indigenous to China and very much the dominant logic in Chinese thought today. And in this logic, we are no longer seeing the world as states, but as flows. And so there is no true or false. There is something that is mostly true, but in constant flux. And within each truth is a seed of falseness that will one day overcome and dominate the truth part, and vice versa. And what I've quoted here is the opening words of one of the 4 classical novels of Chinese literature, The Romance of the Three Kingdoms. And I'll spare you my Mandarin and simply give you the translation. The empire long divided must unite. Long united must divide. And this is something that is central to Chinese thought. In effect, the argument between Heraclitus and Parmenides led to the dominant binary logic in Western thinking, and in China, the champions of Parmenides' side, of Heraclitus' side of the argument won the day. And so the metaphor about the man stepping into the river is the foundation of Chinese thinking to this day. So Yin-Yang is the third one. So my colleague Peter Ping Li attempted to explain these with equations. I'll spare you the mathematics, but if you're interested in the reference, please feel free to reach out to me, and I'll give you the full reference of the paper from 2012. But what I like to do is conclude this part of the talk with a drawing made by a Japanese monk called Senkai Gibon in the 19th century. And his illustration did not have a name in Japanese, although it's generally referenced as a square, triangle, circle. And in English, it does have a name. It's the universe. And I think it's a good illustration of the world we live in. We have people who are squares, who see things binarily. We have pointed people who like to drill down, explore their expertise. And we have round people who are the ones who round the angle, so to speak, and enable harmony to be found. And that's what that drives their logic. So what is true for the universe is true for humanity. And sometimes people, of course, change role. These are archetypes. Not everyone in China would be a yin-yang thinker. Not everyone in the West would be immersed in dialectical logic or binary thinking, but these are archetypes that rule our logic today and our approach to contradictions. So moving on, decisions are ruled by goals, worldviews, representations, which are consolidated from knowledge, and logics. But and not, so as I said, knowledge fuels representations, but goals actually are a combination of values, which we can draw from my ethics categorization, and heuristics, which are also a part of the logic that rules our cognition. And so now I'm going to describe very briefly, once again, the different heuristics that I've inventoried so far. So there are 3 kinds of heuristics. There are the truth discoverers or decision takers, and they share the ontology associated, the same ontology, which is the ontology of being. So these are the people who see the world, who represent the world as states. And the opposing ontology is the ontology of becoming. This is the one that sees the world as flows. So truth discovery. Now, it's very interesting that depending on the language you speak, by default, you make or you take a decision. In French, we say taking a decision as if it was already there to be, and there was only one decision to be arrived at. But in English, decisions are made as if before the decision was made, there could have been any possible outcome. So decision takers draw, in terms of philosophy of science, of knowledge, on positivist approaches, which means that there's an objective truth. And this is, in terms of culture, archetypes, uncertainty avoiding cultures, also known as one-truth cultures, tend to be decision takers. So in other words, in one-truth cultures, there's a single truth possible, and of course, that culture has the truth. This is typical of Roman Catholic countries. People who are financial analysts tend to be of this mind as well as middle managers in bureaucracies. And I would also argue that ministries of the interior tend to consider that whatever facts they establish become the truth as well. Second heuristic is the reality builders. So the implication here is that there can be multiple realities, and they are the decision makers. So still ontology of being. And this is a constructivist approach. And this is very important. It's not necessarily coupled with an empirical thought, empiricism. Empiricism is driven by favoring experience as a source of knowledge, whereas Cartesianism is driven by favoring rationality, reasoning. So here we're in the logic is part of it's the engine of reasoning, and so you can very well be a decision taker or a decision maker and favor empirical sources of knowledge, or not. They're not that coupled. And so, of course, the many truth cultures, the opposite end in the cultural dimension of uncertainty avoidance, is where you find the decision makers. And this is typical of in Christian countries, of Reformed or Protestant countries, for the simple reason that there is not a single head of the church. So that Roman Catholics have a single direction to point at, which is Rome. So that's why they tend to be one truth cultures, whereas there are numerous Protestant churches, and so there's an acceptance that there can be many truths or many realities in Protestant cultures. Pure mathematicians are also constructivist because they create new concepts. So when they do their axiomatic development, they understand that axioms are hypotheses on which they build theorems and lemmas, but that it's also possible to take the opposite axiom and explore also different theorems and different lemmas with the opposing things. This is how we have multiple geometries. We have Euclidean geometries, spherical geometries, hyperbolic geometries and hyperbolic and spherical geometries are enabled by invalidating the parallel postulate. This is the mathematicians understand that mathematics is a social construction, whereas applied mathematicians have much more trouble with that fact. Certified accountants also are constructivists because they know that the books that they certify are stories. Every book tells a story, and an accounting book is no different. And so they're very much aware of the constructivist nature of financial statements, which financial analysts take for granted as the truth. Accountants, on the other hand, are perfectly aware that they're just one side of the story that they approve, they certify. And in public organizations, when we have a separation of power, judicial branches tend to also accept multiple realities. And that is even more true in countries ruled by common law, where there is no objective right and wrong until it is discovered in judicial deliberation. And finally, the third heuristic for this morning is the one that is ruled by the doctrine of the mean, or Zhongyong in Chinese, which is a Confucian precept that Confucian expressed in the Analects, his key collection of his thoughts. And this is simply a precept that encourages you to always take the middle ground. And this is a heuristic that is adopted in cultures arising from volatile environments. And when I say volatile environment, what I mean is that the perception by the people is that the environment is volatile, ever shifting, and so on, which is what Yin-Yang thinking requires, because you're always operating on a perception of the world that is as shifting sands. So when you have an objective truth, it's easy to decide and say put all your eggs in a basket because your understanding of the environment you're in is absolute. Whereas when when you see the world as flows, where things can shift, and people who have power today may not have power tomorrow, it makes sense to take the middle ground, to keep your options open in the future. And so this has, of course, implications in terms of business strategy or even daily management when you have these different heuristics in play. So countries that are influenced by Confucian thought are examples of countries where ambivalence is present and even nurtured. And that includes, that goes beyond Chinese-speaking countries. So Japan, Korea have also the term doctrine of the mean in their native languages. And in terms of professions, well, politicians tend to be of this mind, especially pragmatic politicians. The people who do marketing in fast-moving consumer goods, where consumer taste is fickle, also tend to be of this caliber. It's when you're deciding to invest in R&D in products, and I would say more in D than in R, if you don't know exactly what the customer taste will be when your product is ready to go to market, you may decide to hedge your bets and say invest in 2 different product lines, even though your market study tells you that one is the market favorite. By the time you develop and bring your and distribute the product in question, customer taste may have changed. So that would explain why you would invest your resources in 2 different product lines, just in case your market study is obsolete by the time your products reach the market in question. So examples of organizations with these cultures include Intel and Alibaba in its early stages. So that concludes the logic part of this this lecture. And so now we're going to put all of this together. And here is the whole ELK framework once again. So ethics has a single dimension, but it's one of the richest, I would say, dimension in this framework. Logic has 2 dimensions, and meta knowledge has also 2 dimensions with refinements for the heuristics of rationality. And here we go. So once you have values and heuristics, that enables you to set your goals. Knowledge sources and knowledge types build your world and create your representations. Combining your logic, your goals, and your representations produces decisions. And once again, the decisions lead to words and deeds, actions and communications. And everything to the left of the dotted line is the hidden part of the iceberg. And what we do is we study words and deeds to try and detect the values expressed, the logics that underlie the decision making, and of course the representations, the cognitive representations of whoever is acting or speaking or communicating. So last week I showed you an example of application of the Johari window to knowledge, to the knowledge of the speaker, the locutor knowns. I could have also talked about how you can use the same Johari window to detect values, ethical stances expressed. Of course, I didn't, because the 5 schools of ethics in philosophy are very rich content, and I didn't think it appropriate to add an analysis grid in that first lecture, but we could also do the same and detect whether we're facing a decision-making heuristic or binary logic, and or on contrary, doctrine of the mean type of approach, a hedging, ambivalence nurturing approach, or Yin-Yang thinking or dialectical logic. So this concludes the Global Leadership series. What I've suggested that we do later, if these learning series webinars continue, is that I share with you a series of lectures on patterns of innovation, and this would be the detail of these lectures, but I think at this stage it's interesting to welcome your feedback, whether you're live with me this morning or whether you're watching this later on YouTube. So please feel free to comment on and vote on which lectures you would like to see developed, whether they're new lectures in pattern of innovation, or whether there are some topics in global leadership where you'd like me to drill down. And you can use any of Africa Business School's social media, Facebook, LinkedIn, and YouTube naturally to do so. So are there any questions? Sorry. I'm especially interested in any thoughts you may have on indigenous African logics or Middle Eastern logics. Obviously, Morocco is both influenced by Middle Eastern thought and African thought at large. Okay, well, if there are no questions, and I can understand that these are pretty big chunks to digest, I guess I'll let you get on with your, oh, hold on. Okay, so here's the first question. Based on my experience, what is a dominant heuristic type in Morocco? Well, I have to be very modest here and say that my experience in Morocco is fairly limited. I joined Africa Business School mid-April during the lockdown, so I'm not yet on Moroccan soil in my new role. I do, however, have a very modest experience of consulting in the banking sector in Casablanca in 2006, and what I can really say is that as far as the banking community, and in this case, I would say the financial reporting activity of Moroccan banks is very much aligned with the professional practice of financial reporting to central banks of every bank the world over. And there are essentially two activities that banks have that require expertise in financial reporting, and they are credit risk and market risk. There's a third, which is operational risk, which is actually the same operational risk you would address in any industry, but they don't dominate the same way that credit risk and market risk do. And essentially the commercial banking or credit activity in a bank is a heuristic that is very much of a decision taker mindset, whereas the market risk, the capital markets mindset is very much of a decision making. So though I'm sure that there are parts of banks where ambiguity is maintained in order to keep the peace, so to speak, between different factions. The parts I've been exposed to in Morocco are consistent with the ones I've experienced the world over in the financial services industry. The key point here is that different banks, because of their history and of their portfolio mix, will be either driven by a one truth mindset or a multiple reality mindset. And clearly, if you have little market activity, the one truth mindset may very well dominate internal decision making. Whereas if you're an investment bank, rather than a pure player in focusing on capital markets without any commercial lending or project finance or retail banking, then you will be more of a multiple realities mindset. I should add that one thing that is clear to me, but once again, I need to validate that with more experience, is that Moroccan thinking sits inside the ontology of being. So the three laws of logic that Europe and the Americas and India inherited from Aristotle are also present in African countries for the simple reason that you take Morocco, Arabic, French, all have the same Indo-European root. And so, as I said, language is a proxy for thought for me. So it's easy to say that the binary foundation of our logic has very deep roots, and Arabic should be no different in that respect. For those of you, those Moroccans whose mother tongue is Arabic, think first in Arabic before thinking in other languages. I don't know. I know there are several dialects in Morocco, but I haven't explored whether they share common roots or whether they, like say Basque in France, whether they are linguistic isolates. Basque is a dialect in France, and it hasn't any linguistic cousins. It sits alone. It's not in the Indo-European family tree or in any other family tree of languages. Okay, well, if there are no further questions, I think it's safe to wrap up both this lecture and this series. Feel free, once again, as I said before, to oh, sorry, I'm going the wrong way. Feel free to comment on what you would like me to share next. And I know that we are all attentive at Africa Business School and University Mohammed VI Polytechnique to our stakeholders, and I'm certain that we will engage again online or when the conditions allow in person. Have a great morning, everyone. Goodbye.